My name is Nicole Grabow. I'm an objects conservator. I work with the Midwest Art Conservation Center. For those of you who don't know me or know us, we're located in Minneapolis, so we're quite close to here. And we do a lot of different kinds of things. We do conservation treatment, but we also do a lot of outreach and a lot of workshops, and I do a lot of teaching on preventive conservation techniques. And I define preventive conservation as anything that you don't have to be a conservator to do, but that contributes to the lifetime of your collections materials. And I do include feather cleaning in this. Cleaning is a conservation technique, and it is not a technique to undertake lightly. But it is something that is fairly straightforward, and I'd like to just kind of give you some information from my background in case you have feathers in your collection that you come across and it is your duty to clean them. Hopefully this information will be valuable to you. I will stress that I'm not native, and a lot of my education and my training is very sort of scientific focused. And so I apologize in advance if some of the language seems overly, I don't know, abstract. These are the tools that I have to share with you. And you may have your own ways of naming things or describing things, and I don't mean for this to replace that, but I'm just sharing with you the tools that I have. I'm going to show a few slides just talking a little bit about feathers to encourage you to think about them in maybe a new way or maybe a different way. And then when we do go to the practical exercise, maybe when you're looking at your feathers, you might see some of the things that I'm talking about, or I challenge you to look for those things and to find them. How many of you do work directly with collections material that includes feathers or objects with feathers? Everybody. And how many of you have cleaned, and by cleaned I mean like dusted, feathers before? Many of you. Okay. And I assume the rest of you are interested in doing that. So, okay. There are a lot of different techniques and a lot of different ways to do it. This is the way that I was taught, and I've had good success with it. So just a little background about art conservation. If you're not familiar with the field, we do lots of different things. We don't just do conservation treatment. We also, examination is a big, important part of our work, as well as documentation, documenting everything we do. And I encourage you to incorporate that as much as you can in the work that you do in your institutions, as well as preventive care. Our website is up here, as well as the American Institute for Conservation. This is our national professional organization, and they're a great source for lots of information about conservation and all kinds of questions. If you have bugs, if you need a conservator, if you want to be a conservator, you can go there and find all kinds of stuff. This is just to show you the American Institute for Conservation has a code of ethics, which I think is kind of awesome. This is it. I've highlighted in green some things that are particularly relevant for preventive conservation and for people who may not necessarily be trained as conservators, but are working with collections material. We are informed by, we're governed by informed respect for the cultural property, its character and significance, and the people or persons who created it. So this is part of our core methodology. We practice within the limits of personal competence. What I'm hoping to do here is kind of expand your own personal competence so that you feel a little bit more comfortable maybe with feather materials than perhaps you did before. We strive to select methods and materials that do not adversely affect cultural property. Cleaning can be, kind of intense, and a lot of commercial cleaning products can be really damaging. So the techniques that I'm going to show you are not, when used sensibly, minimize the risks of damage. We document, we create permanent records and reports. We also minimize personal risks, and this is something that is very important when working with native collections and feathered collections in particular, because a lot of native collections have been treated with pesticides, and those are poisons, and they stay on the surface of the object. And if you are handling the object or touching the object, you're exposing yourself to something that could be potentially bad for your health. So it's very important to know as much as you can about your collection and about your materials before you start. Feathers belong to a family of hard fibrous proteins called keratin. And I've listed here some other different types of keratin. They range in their physical properties. Some of them are very, very hard. The ones at the top, tortoise shell and horn, these are really hard materials. And then the ones at the bottom, these are softer. Hair, feathers. And we all know what a feather looks like and feels like. You know that a feather is very soft. So the keratin here has kind of a different physical structure. But its chemical structure is similar to that of horn and bone, and it shares some of those properties. Sorry, not bone, horn. And these are some of the properties. The first one, thermoplasticity. What that means is that when the feather gets warm, it becomes softer. Anything that's thermoplastic is a little bit softer and a little bit more flexible at higher temperatures, and at lower temperatures it becomes more brittle and it's more likely to snap and break. We can use that to our advantage when we're working on cleaning techniques. Feathers, as I mentioned already, are very susceptible to insect damage, and part of the reason is because they are so soft, bugs can chew them easily. They're very delicious, and what you will often see with insect damage on feathers is that they will go for the softest parts of the feathers. So you'll see the damage occurring at the downy fluff at the bottom first, or in between the veins, and they'll leave this harder part alone because it's harder for their teeth to digest, to break apart. They are sensitive to temperature and relative humidity changes. And they also have oils and lipids in their surface, which makes them vulnerable to darkening over time, as well as oxidation, which makes them more brittle. So aged feathers tend to be darker and more brittle than new feathers. They're vulnerable to substances that have a high pH, bases, anything that's alkaline. Proteins are, in general, quite sensitive to bases. If you've ever gotten Clorox bleach on your skin and your skin feels slimy, that's the bleach kind of taking apart the protein in your skin. It'll do the same thing on the feathers. And if your hands are in bleach for too long, it starts to burn. That's what's going on, is the protein is kind of becoming digested. As with other protonation materials, it has a distinctive smell when it's being burnt. This is sort of feather anatomy according to Ask a Biologist. And this is, so take a look at the slide and then look at your own feathers and see if you can start to see these things. But what we see here, these downy barbs down here, which tend to be softer. This is called, according to the biologist, after feather. That's not a term that I generally use, but I do talk about the vein, the rachis here in the middle. I had a French-Canadian teacher who called it the rachis. And then if you kind of magnify this area here, you can see that the rachis is this center part here, and then each little branch that extends out is a barb. But it has its own little branch, which is a barbule. And then if you expand that, the barbule has little hooklets on it. And this enables the feather to hold itself together. When you see a feather that looks like this, the hooklets have been unhooked, but it's like Velcro. You can work to realign them and to rehook them. And this is what a bird does when they use their beak to comb the feather. They're realigning the hooklets so that the vein is one uniform piece. And that is something that we can do when we're cleaning it. There are lots of different feather types. Here are just some examples. I'll tell you that the larger feathers, the tail feathers and the flight feathers, are easier to clean. The softer and the more downy they are, the harder it is to remove the dust and dirt from them. There's this great website, the Feather Atlas, where if you're interested in identifying your feathers, you can go there and they've got pictures of everything and all the different, this is just the common loon breeding plumage, but every bird, every age, every gender. Color comes about in feathers by two primary pathways. Some colors are created from pigments. They tend to be the yellows, the reds, and the browns, and that's very much related to the diet of the bird. Flamingos are pink because they eat shrimp, and that's what makes their feather pink. Their feather's pink. If they have another diet, they're just white. And then a different way that color is formed is through structure. And this generally is the blues and the iridescent colors. And what structural color is and how it differs from pigment color is that it's an optical effect that's related to very tiny particles within the feather. It's actually the same optical effect that makes the sky blue or makes the sky appear blue. It has to do with the way that light interacts with tiny droplets of water that are in the sky. And here in the bird's feather, there are also tiny, tiny air pockets that cause the light to interact to give us the appearance of a blue color. So this depends on the light that we see. This is the same feather. The light needs to be reflecting off of the surface in order for you to see the color blue. Here the light is coming onto the feather, and here the light is coming from the back, and the blue is completely gone. So structural color is, I personally find it fascinating. And it's also very durable. As long as the physical structure of the feather stays intact, it will have its color. And for that reason, feathers can be used for jewelry and the colors do not fade as long as the feather's physical structure stays healthy. This is kingfisher feather jewelry, which is popular in Asia, and there are examples of this type of jewelry that are hundreds of years old that still are as bright as the day that they were made. There aren't a lot of examples of structural color in the art world, so I get kind of excited about it. Things to think about when we're cleaning. In conservation, we strive to make all of our actions and activities as reversible as possible. The idea is that if technology grows and people find better and better ways of doing things, we want them to be able to reverse our work and do it again the better way. There are some examples of techniques that we use that are not reversible, and the most common example of that is cleaning. Once we clean something, we cannot put the dirt back on. So for that reason, I take cleaning very, very seriously and make sure that I understand why I'm doing it, what I'm removing, and what I expect to accomplish, that it is justified. Keep in mind that sometimes cultural materials have had a useful life that has imparted dirt onto the surface that's part of the story that it has to tell. And then so in that case, you may choose not to clean it. What if it has been danced and it has campfire smoke on it? You may make the decision that that's something that you want to stay. If what you see on the surface looks like ordinary museum dust, which tends to be kind of gray and powdery, whereas campfire smoke tends to be more yellow or brown, well, museum dust, I can think of a situation in which that might be part of the story that the object has to tell, but for the most part, it's not significant. And that can be, easily rationalized to remove. Make sure you know if there are any handling restrictions that surround your artifacts. There are many handling restrictions related to eagle feathers and other kinds of feathers as well. So make sure that you understand what the protocols are within your community or the community from which the artifact came, and to respect those. As we handle and as we work with artifacts, we can affect the unseen meaning that they carry, and we want to make sure that we limit that effect and to understand as much as possible about what the implications of our work are before we start. Cleaning feathers can also be affected by associated materials. The feathers that I've given you today are just single loose feathers, but usually they're associated with an artifact. There might be wool thread, there might be leather thong, they might have beads attached to them, or be stuck together with an adhesive. So there might be sort of a more complex situation to address when you're cleaning them. And I would say that this technique is really just for feathers, and you might approach the other associated materials differently. And then also the issue of pesticides. If you believe that there may be pesticides associated with your collection, I would not advise cleaning them because of the risk to yourself. there are conservators and scientists who are working to develop techniques for removing pesticides from collections materials, but it's still a work in progress. We still have a ways to go. And then here's just a couple of detailed pictures that show that what I was talking about realigning the barbs. You can see here in this detailed picture of a feather that a couple of them have crossed and have aligned themselves with the wrong partner. And I use a pointed wooden stick to emulate the bird's beak to comb through the feather. And then you can see afterwards, I think there's like a little tiny kink in it right here. Sometimes, you'll have a little kink. It won't necessarily be perfect. But this is part of what I do when I clean feathers is to comb them and to realign them. So your materials for cleaning, brushes, and I've set some brushes out. There are a variety of sizes and hardnesses. A lot depends on your feathers. Old feathers are more fragile and brittle than new feathers. The feathers you have are all new. These are duck feathers, I think, that I have artificially dirtied. So they're going to be a little bit more resilient than actual collections object feathers. So keep that in mind. Some brushes are stiffer, some brushes are softer. I buy pretty inexpensive brushes because I change them pretty frequently. What you can do, actually this one's pretty good, but some of them have bristles that are really long and it makes them kind of floppy. You can always take scissors and you can reshape your brushes. The stiffness of a brush is related more to the length of the bristles than the material that they're made out of. So if you want your brush to be stiffer, you can just trim a little bit off. You can't do that in reverse though. That's not a reversible process. So buy cheap brushes and buy lots of them. But experiment, small brushes, large brushes, they're all gonna feel different. And then cosmetic sponges, you'll see some of these out too. This is a material that we use quite a bit for cleaning. What you want to look for when you buy this these are used for makeup, but make sure that whatever you're buying does not have any makeup or makeup remover in it. It's got to be just to the sponge. And these sponges this is not an archival product. These go bad. Once you open the container, they'll start to go yellow. So just keep that in mind and throw them away. Don't try to reuse these, and especially throw them away once they're dirty. What else do we need? Soot sponges, that's the other sponge that's next to you. A HEPA vacuum, I didn't bring ours today, but I will usually use a HEPA vacuum when I'm cleaning feathers. I did bring, one of our micro attachment sets just to show you what it looks like. This is the adapter, so it goes on the larger opening. And it gives you a smaller opening so that then you can use these smaller attachments. And you don't need a HEPA vacuum, but it can make your cleaning a lot easier. And it can reduce the amount of dust that you're inhaling. It might not be necessary, but if you find that you're getting a little sneezy or a little headachy, these are really good. And then I will sometimes put over the tip of my over my vacuum, I'll put some cheesecloth just to prevent the vacuum from sucking up any little feather particles that might come off. So I'll attach this like with blue tape or something like that. And what I'll do is I will actually, and it's a little tricky to be honest. Sometimes you need like 3 hands to do this, but I'll hold the brush in my dominant hand and the vacuum nozzle in my non-dominant hand, and I will brush the dust into the vacuum nozzle, like so. And that can be a little challenging when working on, say, a headdress, for example, where there might not be something supporting it from behind. If you have an intern or a partner, you can work together. Someone can hold a piece of paper like this, blotter paper, behind the feather to give it a little support. Someone can hold the vacuum. You can tape the vacuum to like a chair or a stand and work close to it. And as I said, you can also work without a vacuum, but be mindful then that your dust has to go somewhere. So where is it going? Rules of thumb, know your dirt. As I mentioned, campfire smoke tends to be yellow or brown, and museum dust tends to be gray. So do some little test cleaning areas before. The bladder paper is nice because you can kind of see what color your dirt is. And you can maybe try with a little bit of a soot sponge. You kind of get a little bit of dirt and see what color it is. Know if your object has a history that might, contain something on the surface that's important. So you can go back and forth between the brushes and the sponge. I'd like you to experiment. And I always recommend mechanical cleaning before you introduce any solvent. I did put some little containers of water, and what you can do is you can try dipping the cosmetic sponge in the water, get it a little bit damp, and then see how that changes things. It can be fairly aggressive, and the feather can absorb the moisture a little bit and make it a little soft. So if you have a really brittle or damaged feather, you're more likely to cause loss if you're using water. So I always recommend to start without water, and hopefully that will be enough. But sometimes you want to go a little bit farther, and the water can help you with that. And just walking you through a few pictures. Here's a feather, a poor pathetic feather before cleaning. A little detail. Brush cleaning. This is without a vacuum. You can see all the dirt that comes off. And then I'm going in with the sponge to get a little bit more. You can use a little cotton rolled onto your pointed stick to get the rachis. You can also use a spray bottle with deionized water to get your bladder paper damp behind the feather, and that can help the dirt stick to the paper better and give you just a little bit of moisture, a little bit of humidity. You can see the dirt on the swab. The keratin has kind of a memory, and when it's allowed to soften with a little bit of heat, it can kind of return back to its regular position. This is something that I would do, very cautiously. Again, better for newer feathers than for older feathers, and you don't need a lot of heat, just like a hot air dryer held, maybe farther away than this. This is just sort of for the photograph. But a little bit of warm air can help you to manipulate the feather. Here is the after treatment. So this is the picture that says manage your expectations, because it's not going to look like a new feather. This is a very soft, friable, vulnerable material that was very badly damaged. And it's, the likelihood of it looking brand new again is low, especially considering how bad it was before. You may have better results on something that's more dusty and not so much distorted. But if you look at it next to the before, you can see that there has been a significant improvement. This is another reason why documentation can be helpful. If you take a little picture beforehand and then you clean it and then you look back at what it looked like beforehand, it's like, oh yeah, I did do something. This did help, this did improve it. I think that might be the last slide, and then we can get to some hands-on stuff. So I would do as much as you can before using water. If you're working on collections materials, you will likely not need to use water at all. I usually use gloves when I'm cleaning, but feathers are an example unusual in the collection materials world, where the oils from your fingers are actually a little bit beneficial to the feathers. The birds would add oil to their feathers as they clean them, coming out of their beak. And so, while the oils on our hands are a little bit different, they still can have kind of a replenishing effect for the feathers. That said, I don't want you to handle feathers that might have mold or things that are bad for you on them. So it's really kind of up to you how comfortable you feel and how much information you have about what the dirt is on the feathers. I can tell you that what's on them now is not going to harm you. This is like a mixture of like dirt from the yard and soap and water and pumice. There's nothing toxic in these feathers. So, you should feel free to go ahead and use your fingers if you'd like to. But when you're working with a collections material, it's kind of a balance. It's like, okay, protect myself and know what is there. But do know that, especially when you're realigning, when you're combing, when you're finger combing, your fingers can be really helpful in this process. There's so much sensitivity in our fingertips that we lose with gloves. So I would encourage you to try a little bit without gloves and do a little cleaning with gloves too, and know that there's some flexibility there, particularly with this material. I have gloves in, this is large, that's small, and this is medium, so feel free to kind of pass them around until you find a size that you like. Sometimes what I will do is I'll put a glove on one hand, the hand that is holding the feather, and then the hand that's holding the brush doesn't have a glove. It's up to you. You can totally run to Walmart for brushes. I'm fine with that. What I would stay away from is brushes where the bristles have a lot of color. Like you don't want bright pink brushes because that color can transfer to the object. Cedar is supposed to prevent insect damage. I think that your best bet against insect damage is good housekeeping policies and checking your collection regularly to make sure, and to keeping the collections area clean, and have it be well lit so that you can see insects if there is a problem, and then identifying problems quickly and isolating those objects. That's what I would recommend for bugs. If you've had freezing, if your feathers have been frozen to treat for an insect infestation, can you clean right away, or do you want to wait? And the answer is to wait. Because of the thermoplasticity of the feather, they're going to be more brittle when they're cold. So you want to make sure that they come all the way up to room temperature and that they're a little bit softer. Because the colder they are, the more brittle they are, the more you're going to risk physical damage. You guys all look like you're having a lot of fun, which is good. And do remember, these are destructible objects, so feel free to get too much water on them, go too far, see if you can break them. Sometimes I tell my students that, when it doesn't matter, break something and see what it takes and how you can recognize where that point is. Know when you're doing damage, because then when it does count, you want to be able to stop before you get there. But if before you do the realigning of the veins, it's good to have them as clean as possible, because the dirt is going to prevent the hooklets from attaching, and they should be as dry as possible also. And sometimes, as I said, do that with your fingers. Some feathers, here's an example here, some feathers have been dyed. This is not a red feather, but it has some red dye on it. You might see that coming off on your sponges. You want to be really careful about that. You want to preserve the color that the artists have added to the feather. So if you do see any color coming off on your sponge, you want to stop and kind of step back, oh, okay, this is too far. I need to be softer, I need to use a softer brush. You don't want to damage the material. So your feather is gonna comb better if those little hooklets are still healthy. And that's one of the risks of over cleaning, is that you can clean the hooklets off and then it won't comb as well. So if you're finding that your feather has gotten really ratty and you're having trouble realigning it, it could be that the hooklets have been damaged. They may have been damaged before you got to it, but be aware that that is something that can happen through cleaning also. And that's one of the reasons why we want to be really careful with our use of water, because it's the water that's really going to make those things fall off. Plumes are really hard. The question is, how do you clean plumes? Those are the really downy, fluffy ones. I would avoid water with those ones, because they're just going to fall apart on you. And I would use a softer brush. You'll notice some of the brushes have soft bristles and some of them are stiffer. Use a soft bristle brush and reduce your expectations. They get stained with dust really easily, so sometimes you take the dust off, but they still look gray. It's not as successful cleaning plumes. We just do the best we can.
Would you use a vacuum at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Even though it comes off really easy?
Cover your vacuum with a little thing. If you've got variable speed, low speed.
Yeah, I got 2 hairdressers.
Yeah, and if you see stuff coming off, then it's too much pressure. My ability to come to this conference and to present to you today is supported in part through the National Endowment for the Humanities, so I just want to acknowledge them and their generous support. And thank you all for coming and for your great questions and enthusiasm.